Hey everyone, I hope that you're enjoying this series, Ancient Egypt, Dynasty by Dynasty. We still have a long way to go, but the good thing is that as we progress along the timeline of Egyptian history, we have more material remains, inscriptions, and artifacts to work with. These include iconic monuments, such as pyramids. In fact, it was the kings of Egypt's Third Dynasty who commissioned the country's first pyramids. Let's take a look and see what we can learn about one of Egypt's most famous dynasties. Traditionally, Dynasty 3 has been the start of the period of Egyptian history known as the Old Kingdom. Not everyone, though, agrees, and some scholars make the argument that the Old Kingdom really started with the Fourth Dynasty, because the Third was socially and politically closer to Dynasties 1 and 2. For our purposes here, we're going to go with what the consensus of scholars have historically agreed upon, in that the Third Dynasty was the start of the Egyptian Old Kingdom. Since most of them also tend to place the dates of the Old Kingdom to between 2686 to 2181 BC, we'll also be using those dates here. As for Dynasty 3, since it's the first dynasty of the Old Kingdom period, it also starts in 2686 BC. So now that we know the period of Egyptian history that we're dealing with, let's continue. According to the Abydos king list, and another that has come to be known as the Turin canon, 5 kings belonged to Dynasty 3, though their order of succession is not agreed upon. The generally recognized first king of the dynasty is, well, relatively famous. He's known by several names, such as Sekhemkhet or as Djoser in Manetho's list, but most today know him by the name Djoser, also pronounced Djoser. However, the Abydos king list and the Turin canon have recorded one of Djoser's brothers, Sekhemkhet, better known as Nebka, as the dynasty's first sovereign. The reason that we today place Djoser as the first king of Dynasty 3 is because archaeological evidence seems to support the hypothesis that he directly succeeded Sekhemkhet, his father and the last king of Dynasty 2. This is because it's quite clear that it was Djoser who presided over Sekhemkhet's burial, meaning that he must have been the next king in line and not Nebka. Along with almost identical grave goods found in both of their tombs, the Saqqara king list also records him as Sekhemkhet's immediate successor, which further strengthens the claim that it was indeed Djoser and not Nebka who started a new dynasty. For thousands of years, Djoser was remembered as a great king, one of the very few whose memory seems to have lived on throughout Egypt's ancient history. In fact, it's said that when the New Kingdom scribe, who wrote the Turin canon, came to the name of Djoser, instead of writing it in black, as was customary, he chose the color red to indicate the special place that the king held in the hearts of the Egyptian people. There were probably several reasons for this, many of which unfortunately we'll likely never know. One important reason could have simply been stability. Remember, Djoser's second dynasty predecessors oversaw a period where much of Egypt was divided. There were revolts in the cities of the northern Delta region, and also what seemed to have been sectarian conflicts between the followers of the god Seth and those of the god Horus. Such factors likely contributed to Dynasty 2's rulers having at best a tenuous grip over Egypt. Contrast this to what we know of Djoser's 19-year reign, which in comparison to those of earlier kings was replete with large-scale building projects, as well as trade and state-sponsored mining expeditions to the southwestern Sinai region. This area contained large quantities of valuable metals and turquoise. Such capital-intensive endeavors for any ruler of the time would have been extremely difficult, if not nearly impossible, without a great deal of internal political stability, especially in the northern delta region, which would have been on the land route to the Sinai Peninsula. Djoser's decision to be buried at the necropolis at Saqqara, just outside the capital of Memphis, was a break with the centuries-old kingly tradition of being laid to rest within the royal cemetery of Abydos. This is significant for a couple of reasons. One is that, at least according to Manetho, the Third Dynasty's family was originally from Memphis, and so Djoser and his descendants may have naturally favored the area. It also probably meant that the old Thinite Abydos aristocracy, from which the first kings of Egypt belonged to, may have now commanded less power or were less relevant when it came to running the affairs of the country. The other, and perhaps more important reason, is that by having the royal mortuary complex closer to Lower Egypt and the Delta region, which was the epicenter of past rebellions, meant that by Djoser's time, the king and the central government had consolidated their authority over that area. For his eventual burial, Djoser's vizier, Imhotep, who was also his chief architect, designed a special tomb for the king. And what a tomb it was. Actually, still is. The monument that I'm referring to is Djoser's famous step pyramid at Saqqara, and it's the first large, all-stone building that we know of. Until Djoser, all previous kings, at least from the First Dynasty onward, were buried underneath mastabas, which were rectangular-shaped buildings with sloping sides and a flat roof. The actual burial chamber was underground, with the mastaba itself usually consisting of several rooms with objects and offerings that the ancient Egyptians believed would join with the deceased ruler in the afterlife. The so-called step pyramid isn't actually a true pyramid, but essentially 6 mastaba-like layers stacked on top of each other. The final layer, or level, is almost 63 meters, or 200 feet, high. Below the step pyramid, archaeologists discovered several burial chambers for the king and 11 members of his family. At one time, there were open courtyards and temple chambers around the pyramid where ceremonies and daily offerings were made on behalf of the king. Before we go on, a few words about Imhotep. He was more than just an architect. Along with being Djoser's vizier and most trusted confidant, Imhotep was actually best remembered and most revered in ancient Egypt as a physician, and later on was even deified and worshipped as a god of medicine and healing, especially during the Egyptian late period. This was actually a great honor, because throughout Egyptian history, only a handful of non-monarchs ever became gods. And yet, despite being such a revered individual, Imhotep's final resting place has never been found, though it's believed that it was probably somewhere in or around Saqqara. There's an interesting story about Imhotep that comes from an inscription on the island of Sahel around the Nile's first cataract that dates to the Ptolemaic period. It tells of how King Djoser was saddened by a 7-year drought and famine that afflicted Egypt, and so he seeks the help of his trusted vizier, Imhotep, who eventually visits the sanctuary of the god Khnum, the deity responsible for the flooding of the Nile. There, Imhotep falls asleep and is visited in a dream by Khnum. At the end of the dream, Khnum promises to make the Nile flood again, and after waking up, Imhotep rushes back to Djoser and tells him everything about the dream, after which the king orders the temple of Khnum to be restored to its former glory and also grants the sanctuary and its priests some special privileges. The Turin canon states that Djoser reigned for 19 years, which, given all of his achievements, is a relatively short period of time. In fact, the Great Step Pyramid wasn't even complete at the time of his death. In spite of this, the monument is testament to this larger-than-life figure from ancient Egyptian history. Until 1951, nothing was really known about Djoser's successor, Sekhemkhet, other than his name. In that year, though, Egyptian archaeologist Zakaria Gonium discovered an unfinished step pyramid buried deep within the sands of Saqqara. Upon further excavation, it was determined that the pyramid belonged to Sekhemkhet. The pyramid was incomplete, but by its construction, it seems as if it was intended to have been even taller than Djoser's pyramid, with 7 instead of 6 steps. The Turin Canon, the Palermo Stone, and Manetho all state that Sekhemkhet ruled for only 6 to 7 years, which is probably why a massive and time-consuming project, such as his pyramid, ended up not being completed by the time of his death. Beneath the pyramid, Sekhemkhet's supposed sarcophagus was discovered to be sealed tight with the original gypsum mortar in place, meaning that it had remained unopened for over 4,500 years. In 1954, archaeologists decided to break the seal and see what was inside. To their surprise, the sarcophagus was completely empty. The only explanation that they could come up with was that the real body must have been buried elsewhere. But where? To this day, no one knows the answer to this mystery. Other than the items discovered in and around the pyramid, the other main testaments to Sekhemkhet's short reign are an inscription on a cliff in the Sinai showing the king smiting some sort of desert captive, and a seal impression discovered far to the south on the island of Elephantine by the Nile's first cataract. The next king of the Second Dynasty is believed to have been Khaba. Almost nothing is known about the events of his reign, but like his 2 predecessors, Khaba also had a pyramid built for himself, the so-called Layer Pyramid, located at the site of Zawiyet El Aryan, just a few miles south of modern Cairo. Archaeologists believe that the pyramid was never actually used, and so we have the same problem as with Sekhemkhet, specifically that of a king's missing body. That's just another mystery in the history of ancient Egypt. According to the Turin Canon, Khaba reigned for only 7 years. While the order of the previous kings is debated, Egyptologists almost unanimously agree that a king by the name of Huni was the last ruler from Egypt's Third Dynasty. Huni's 24-year reign was accompanied by massive construction projects, which may have helped to pave the way for the pyramid frenzy that would follow with the Fourth Dynasty. Despite this, events in the life and reign of Huni are unknown, though it seems that he ruled over a politically stable and prosperous Egyptian society that extended from the Mediterranean Sea in the north to beyond the First Cataract and into Nubia. Because Huni's Horus name isn't known, some have identified him with the mysterious Hor-Khejet, whose stela was discovered in the 1960s. It has the first known depiction showing the god Horus embracing a king. Though the art style of the stela seems to be relatively consistent with that of the early Old Kingdom, this still doesn't prove that Hor-Khejet and Huni were one and the same. While Huni's reign may have ended around 2600 BC, his presence, at least in the Egyptian society of the Old Kingdom, did not. According to the chronicle known as the Palermo Stone, which was compiled over a century after Huni's death, it's written that donations were made to a mortuary temple dedicated to Huni, meaning that there was some sort of cult that revolved around him well after his death. There's also a pyramid at the site of Meidum, about 100 kilometers south of Cairo. Believed to have been started during the reign of Huni and later added to by King Snefru of the Fourth Dynasty, it's the first structure that we know of that starts to resemble a true pyramid. Unfortunately, there were a lot of construction errors that were made, and part of the structure eventually collapsed. Though the pyramid and its supporting buildings never seem to have been completed, such an unintended trial run may have helped the architects and engineers of the Fourth Dynasty to construct the famous pyramids at Giza that we all marvel at today. We'll take a closer look at that and more in the next program on Dynasty 4. Stay tuned. Once again, thanks so much for stopping by. You all are amazing. I'd also really like to thank Grandkek69, Jaap de Graaf, Pasta Frola, Michael Lewis, Danielle Allen, Danny Van Eck, WanXTV, Robert Morgan, Frank, Tim Lane, Brendan Redman, Faridun Dadachanji, Jimmy Daruwala, Sher Kam, Farhad Kama, and all of the channel's patrons on Patreon for helping to support this and all future content. Check out the benefits to being a Patreon member, and if you'd like to join, feel free to click the link in the video description. You can also follow History with Sai on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, as well as continue to listen to special audio programs on the History with Sai podcast. Thanks again, and stay safe.